The hedgerows of Normandy were older than the nations fighting among them. They had been raised by monks and farmers 1,000 years before. Tanks were imagined earthen embankments 4 to 6 feet high, crowned with roots and brambles, forming a green labyrinth across the Norman countryside. To the men who landed at Omaha and Utah beaches, they appeared at first as picturesque boundaries between fields. Within a week, they became the deadliest defensive system in Western Europe. By June 9th, the Allies had learned a bitter new vocabulary: bocage. What sounded bucolic on paper turned out to be a fortress disguised as farmland. Each small field was a room, bordered by embankments dense enough to stop tanks, screened enough to hide snipers, and ancient enough that even 105mm shells sometimes failed to collapse them. The hedgerow country of Normandy was not terrain, it was architecture, medieval and murderous, and no one in the Allied planning staffs had prepared for it. The American army that came ashore in France had been trained to fight like an engineer's equation: fire and movement, armor and infantry in harmony, a relentless advance across open ground supported by artillery and air power. It was doctrine perfected in the desert, conceived on Kansas prairies, and rehearsed on British downs. But France, in June 1944, refused to behave like a desert or a plain. It folded itself into hedges, thickets, and stone. The men who had stormed across North Africa and Sicily suddenly found themselves in a cage of earth. The first tank to meet a hedgerow did what tanks were trained to do: it attacked. The Sherman's 75mm gun spat high explosive into the greenery. The explosion threw leaves, dirt, and dust into the air. The crew advanced. Then the tank began to climb. Its nose lifted, its treads churned, and in that moment of exposure, its belly flashing bare metal, the waiting German gunner fired. The shot struck the differential housing dead center. A column of smoke rose from the burning tank. Infantry crouched behind it, froze in place. The lesson was instant and unforgettable. The hedgerow was not cover. It was a trap. Every field became a fight. The Americans learned that the Germans had mapped these green walls with the precision of surveyors. Behind every opening, a machine gun. Behind every bend, a PaK-40 anti-tank gun. At every corner, an ambush. German infantry from the 352nd and 3rd Parachute Divisions had dug firing positions into the hedges themselves, carving loopholes into the roots and embankments. They had the patience of men defending home soil and the advantage of terrain that forced every engagement to occur at spitting distance. Infantry platoons discovered that to cross 50 yards of open ground between hedges was to challenge a firing squad. They crawled forward, digging with bayonets, throwing grenades into gaps they couldn't see. They learned to fight not for towns or roads, but for trees and mounds of dirt. A corporal from the 29th Infantry Division described it bluntly in his letter home: "We don't move in miles here, we move in hedges." Commanders tried everything that theory allowed. Engineers brought satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes, hoping to blow gaps wide enough for tanks. The explosions looked heroic, filmed by Signal Corps cameramen, but the craters left behind swallowed vehicles whole. The banks were too dense to shatter cleanly. They collapsed inward, creating pits that trapped the very tanks they were meant to help. Each failed breach cost another crew, another hour, another life. When the smoke cleared, the enemy was still waiting 50 yards away, unmoved, unbroken. The Germans, veterans of the Eastern Front, watched with professional admiration. They could not believe their fortune, an enemy superior in numbers and air power reduced to clawing through farmland 1 acre at a time. "Every hedgerow is a fortress," a German lieutenant wrote in his field diary, later captured by American intelligence. The Americans fight bravely, but they fight the ground itself. The statistics told the same story. By mid-June, U.S. First Army's daily advance had slowed to a crawl, sometimes less than half a mile. Casualties rose by the thousands. Entire armored battalions lost a third of their vehicles in a single day, not to German tanks, but to hedgerows and ambushes. Field reports grew desperate. One commander wrote, "Each field must be taken like a fortress assault. The enemy does not retreat. He relocates 20 yards back." Air power, the Allies' great advantage, was useless in the maze. Bombers could flatten a village, but not a single hidden gun beneath an overgrown bank. Fighters strafed the lanes, but the enemy simply melted into the foliage. Tanks, deprived of visibility and maneuver, became lumbering targets. "We have fire superiority everywhere, but in front of our faces," General Omar Bradley observed grimly. The Army's manuals had anticipated many kinds of war: open, mobile, urban, amphibious, but not this. In their calculations, France was supposed to reward speed. Instead, every mile extracted blood. The 2nd Armored Division lost tanks faster than replacements could be landed at Omaha. Infantrymen advanced by crawling, by inches, through gaps barely wide enough for one man. The communication between units, once a matter of radio and map, degenerated into shouts through walls of dirt. A sergeant of the 4th Infantry Division summed it up after surviving 3 days in the bocage. "You can't see 10 yards ahead. The Germans can see 50. It's like fighting ghosts with machine guns." Every hedgerow cost ammunition, gasoline, and ours 3 currencies, the U.S. Army had in abundance, but could not afford to waste. A single tank battalion could burn through a day's fuel supply, advancing the length of a football field. Each breach required covering fire, smoke, engineers, and artillery, all for a gain, measured in paces. The tactical problem became strategic by sheer multiplication. Normandy contained thousands of such hedgerows. At that rate, the liberation of France would take years. The command echelons studied aerial photos and intelligence reports, but nothing on paper conveyed the claustrophobia of the hedgerows. Generals who had driven across the deserts of Tunisia and the plains of Sicily suddenly found their divisions boxed in, unable to see their own flanks. Coordination broke down, casualty reports multiplied, even success was indistinguishable from stalemate. In early June, Bradley's staff convened a meeting near Isidni. The conversation circled the same grim conclusions. Artillery could not reach what it could not see, infantry could not cross what it could not clear, and tanks, the backbone of the Allied advance, could not fight from inside a cage. Someone proposed levelling the hedgerows with bulldozers, but there weren't enough in France to cover even one core sector. Someone else suggested flamethrowers. The hedges burned, but the embankments remained. Another officer, exhausted and honest, finally said what everyone knew: "Gentlemen, we are bleeding ourselves to death against dirt." The irony was cruel. The American army had brought with it the greatest material power the world had ever seen: thousands of tanks, endless ammunition, a sky full of planes, and yet it was being held hostage by medieval agriculture. The hedgerow turned every battle into a knife fight and every tank into a liability. By the 3rd week of June, men began to improvise. Some crews welded makeshift blades from scrap metal, others rammed hedges at full throttle, hoping speed could substitute for design. Most died trying. The Germans kept count. The mood across the front hardened into frustration and fatalism. Infantrymen joked bitterly that the brass had promised them Paris, but delivered a French farmyard. Tankers began naming their machines after what they fought: haystack killer, hedge hopper, green hell. But no machine, no tactic, no doctrine had yet solved the problem. Normandy had turned the modern army into a prehistoric one-men, and steel clawing through roots and mud. The Americans had come to liberate Europe with strategy and firepower. Instead, they found themselves fighting a wall older than their republic. And somewhere beyond those hedgerows, hidden in the green geometry of Normandy, the Germans waited for the next tank to show its belly. The secret weapon that would change everything had not yet been imagined. When it finally appeared, it would look ridiculous, a welder's joke on treads. The officers would laugh, then they would stop laughing, and the hedgerows of Normandy would never again be safe for the men who hid behind them. The weapon that would change the battle for Normandy did not come from a general's staff or an engineer's drawing board. It was born in a muddy field, in the mind of a sergeant with a welder's instinct and a contempt for unsolved problems. Curtis G. Culin Jr. of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, mechanized, was not an inventor by trade. Before the war, He'd been a New Jersey mechanic who could make a broken engine run with a hammer and a prayer. In France, he was just another man trying to stay alive in the bocage. The idea came from a private in his unit, a throwaway comment muttered in frustration after watching another tank hang helplessly on a hedgerow bank. "Why don't we put some damn saw teeth on the front of the tank and cut through it?" the private said. "Most ideas like that die in the air." Culin caught this one. He studied the tank and the hedge. The geometry was simple. The Sherman climbed when it hit the base of the embankment because its rounded nose rode up instead of into the wall. What if the tank didn't ride the wall, but stabbed it? What if it could drive through instead of over? That night, Culin scrounged through a pile of wrecked German beach obstacles left over from D-Day, the heavy iron Czech hedgehogs that once lined Omaha Beach. Their angled beams were strong, plentiful, and useless for anything else. He hauled several back to camp, cut them with a torch, and welded the pieces into 4 long, tapering spikes. He arranged them in a pattern like a comb, reinforcing them with crossbars and diagonal braces. The contraption looked like something dragged out of a medieval barn, ugly, uneven, and absurd. He called it a hedgerow cutter. Others called it junk. When he showed the device to his officers, laughter came first. One lieutenant reportedly said, "You've built a plough, Sergeant. Maybe we should start planting corn." Another predicted that the thing would snap off on the first hedge or jam the suspension. Even sympathetic officers saw it as improvisation at best, folly at worst. Culin didn't argue. He just asked for a test tank. They gave him one, an old M4 Sherman, that had already been patched and repainted more times than its crew could count. The test field was a typical Norman pasture, thick earthen walls, woven roots, and hidden stones. The soldiers gathered to watch, most expecting a show that would end in twisted steel. Culin climbed onto the turret, shouted something inaudible over the idling engine, and gave the signal. The Sherman advanced. Instead of climbing, it dove. The steel tusks bit deep under the hedge, shattering roots and tearing out stones like claws. The tank drove forward, engine roaring, and the hedge lifted from the ground in a violent heave of dirt and leaves. In seconds, the tank burst through the far side, level, unexposed, gun ready. The spectators stared. Then the cheering began. They ran it again, at an angle, through thicker ground. It worked. They reversed, and did it from the opposite side. It worked again. Every test ended with the same astonished silence, followed by disbelief that such a simple thing had not been thought of before. For the first time since D-Day, a tank had defeated a hedgerow on its own terms. Cullin's commanding officer immediately telephoned higher headquarters. His message was brief. "Have seen a miracle. Send observers." By the next day, engineers from the 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions arrived. They examined the welds, took measurements, and shook their heads in wonder. The design was crude but effective. The physics were impeccable. The hedgerow cutter turned a tank into a battering ram. It didn't just make a gap, it made many gaps fast, clean, and repeatable. Cullin's invention spread by rumour before it spread by order. Maintenance crews began scavenging scrap steel and welding their own versions. Ordnance depots, seeing the excitement, started cutting German obstacles into pre-sized pieces for shipment to the front. Within days, the beaches that had once repelled the invasion were being harvested for material to fuel it, but not everyone was convinced. When word of the Rhino tank reached headquarters, staff officers dismissed it as a local improvisation. Bureaucracy had little room for sergeants with welding torches. A few higher-ups even argued that the cutters would slow tanks down, or that the weight would stress the suspension. They wanted tests, data, diagrams. The frontline soldiers had none of those things, only proof written in shattered hedges and saved lives. In early July, General Omar Bradley himself visited the 2nd Armoured Division near Saint-Lô to see the device in action. Cullin's unit staged a demonstration. The general watched as a Sherman, equipped with the cutter, accelerated toward a hedgerow that had stopped 3 previous tanks in that very field. The tank hit the wall at full throttle, the teeth dug deep, and the entire embankment buckled, dirt sprayed. The tank levelled, crossed, and fired its gun before the dust settled. Bradley turned to his staff and said, "Give every tank one." The order went out that afternoon. Within weeks, over 500 tanks were fitted with Culin's invention. Welders worked around the clock, scavenging every inch of scrap metal they could find. The cutters were nicknamed Rhino tusks, and the modified Shermans became Rhino tanks. What had begun as a joke in a hedgerow now became official U.S. Army equipment. Culin received a Legion of Merit and a promotion, but more important than medals was what his device meant. It was not just a tool, it was a change in thinking. The Americans had stopped trying to fight the hedgerows as obstacles and started turning them into weapons of their own. The laughter that had greeted Cullin's contraption vanished, replaced by urgency and awe. By the end of July, the hedgerows that had swallowed an army became a network of roads. Tanks no longer died on the embankments, they went through them. The Germans, who once used those green walls for cover, now found themselves trapped behind them. The device born from mockery had rewritten the geometry of battle. The bocage, which had turned every field into a fortress, now became a highway for American steel. And all it had taken was a sergeant, a welder's torch, and a refusal to accept that dirt could stop an army. The beaches that had repelled an invasion now served it. The twisted German obstacles, the hedgehogs and check crosses that once snarled the surf at Omaha and Utah became raw material for an army's metamorphosis. In the salt air and summer heat, American engineers turned those wrecked symbols of defense into the teeth of a new kind of assault. The process began almost overnight. Once General Bradley gave his quiet order, "Give every tank one the entire logistical machine of the U.S." First Army shifted gears. Ordnance officers, mechanics, and welders began to improvise what would become the most widespread field modification of the Normandy campaign. There were no blueprints, no official kits, just sketches drawn, in grease pencil, and memorized by torchlight. From the beaches, recovery details dragged tons of rusting German steel out of the sand. Landing craft obstacles, angular beams anchored in concrete, were cut loose and hauled inland by bulldozers and trucks. At depots near Isigny and Carentan, soldiers with cutting torches reduced them to manageable lengths. The smell of burned salt and iron hung in the air as sections of the Atlantic Wall became the raw stock for Cullin's invention. Each hedgehog yielded 2 or 3 usable prongs. Each tank required 4 to 6. The math was relentless. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of prongs, and miles of welding. But the Americans, whose supply genius could feed and fuel an army of millions across an ocean, adapted instantly. Improvisation became production. Workshops sprang up in barns, orchards, and roadside clearings. At night, their torches glowed like fireflies against the hedgerows. Men from the 2nd Armoured Division, the 746th Tank Battalion, and the 747th Tank Battalion laboured under blackout shades, cutting, hammering, welding, the clang of steel mixed with the drone of generators and the hum of insects. The crews joked that they were turning dragons into rhinos, the dragons being the iron obstacles that had once guarded Hitler's fortress Europe. Each tank modification took about 6 hours. The design, though born of improvisation, followed a rough pattern. 4 sharpened tusks welded to the lower front hull, reinforced by diagonal braces and a steel crossbar. The fit had to be exact too low, and the tusks would dig into the ground too high, and the tank would ride up and expose its belly. Welders measured, adjusted, and checked alignment by eye. Perfection was not the goal. Function was. By mid-July, the First Army's ordnance reports recorded Rhino cutter installations proceeding at 24 per day. The term Rhino had caught on, borrowed from a corporal who'd compared the modified Shermans to charging beasts tearing through jungle. The name fit. The sight of a Rhino tank in motion, its steel tusks gouging into earth and roots, was both primitive and modern, an image of industrial evolution in real time. Field expediency soon hardened into policy. The First Army ordered all new Shermans arriving from England to be fitted with cutters before leaving the depots. Engineers at Cherbourg began fabricating standardized kits using salvaged steel and spare armor plate. The improvisation had become doctrine, but the transformation wasn't only mechanical, it was psychological. Tank crews who had dreaded the hedgerows now sought them out. Infantrymen, who once feared being trapped behind stalled armor, cheered as Rhino tanks ploughed through barriers that had seemed indestructible weeks earlier. Morale, a fragile commodity in the bocage, surged. German observers noticed, too. Reports intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed confusion and disbelief. A captured diary from a grenadier in the 275th Infantry Division noted, "The Americans have machines that eat the earth. The hedges no longer protect us." Another entry added grimly, "We shoot, they come through anyway." The shift in tempo was immediate and measurable. Before the Rhino, an armoured battalion might take 2 hours to clear a single field. Afterward, it took minutes. A company that had once crawled a few hundred yards in a day now advanced a full mile before noon. Each breach multiplied the next. The hedgerows that had once defined the battlefield now ceased to matter. Still, the work was dangerous. Welding under combat conditions meant risk fuel fumes, ammunition nearby, constant exposure to enemy artillery. In some depots, soldiers welded through the night under camouflage nets, dousing torches only when German spotter planes droned overhead. Supply trucks brought steel and welding rods by day. At dusk, they brought coffee and cigarettes. The war's front line was now half workshop, half battlefield. By July 20th, an estimated 60% of the tanks in 7 Corps carried cutters. In some outfits, the figure reached 90%. When the first official after-action reports arrived at headquarters, they read like conversion testimonies. Device effective beyond expectation, enables armoured units to maintain level posture through hedgerow, no longer necessary to expose lower hull or use demolition. Another. Enemy anti-tank positions surprised and overwhelmed, infantry now advancing with armour in continuous coordination. Even the engineers, usually the unsung specialists of war, felt the thrill of vindication. Captain Walter Mahaffey, 2nd Armoured Division Ordnance Officer, wrote home, "We've built a factory in the fields. It's the damnedest thing, every hedgehog we melt down kills another German gun." The cutters were not perfect. They occasionally bent or snapped under extreme strain. A few tanks caught fire when sparks from welding torches ignited spilled gasoline. Yet for every malfunction, 10 more tanks broke through where none could before. The hedgerows that had dictated the war's tempo were being erased one by one, replaced by corridors of churned earth and broken roots. And in those narrow corridors, a new kind of warfare took shape. The Rhino Shermans advanced at full throttle, followed closely by infantry platoons riding their decks. The tanks rammed through, crushed the walls, and spat fire at point-blank range. Behind them came half-tracks, jeeps, and supply trucks. For the first time, the bocage no longer belonged to the defender. What had begun as a field experiment now became an industrial campaign. The Americans were turning invention into scale, improvisation into doctrine. In a few weeks, the hedgerows of Normandy had gone from fortress to farmland again, ploughed not by peasants, but by tanks born of scrap and desperation. The men who built them would never forget the sight. Sparks flying into the French night, tanks lined like beasts in a forge, the smell of diesel and molten iron. They had made something new out of wreckage, an army of rhinos, born on a beach, destined to break through to Saint-Lô. The hedgerows that had once choked the American advance now trembled beneath steel. Operation COBRA, the breakout from Normandy, was not born in secrecy, but in necessity. For 7 weeks, the U.S. First Army had fought for every field, every mound of dirt, every yard of France. Now, with the Rhinos leading the charge, the plan was simple. Break the line, flood the plains, and finally make the war mobile again. The prelude began with thunder. At 9:38 on July 25th, more than 1,500 American bombers appeared over the horizon, B-17 seconds, B-24 seconds, and B-26 seconds, flying in tight waves. The earth shook as 3,000 tons of explosives fell on the German front near Saint-Lô. Entire sectors disappeared in geysers of soil and smoke. Men in foxholes miles away felt the ground ripple under their boots. Then, As the sky cleared and the dust settled, the order came through 1st Army headquarters. Attack, all units forward. The tanks that rolled out were no longer ordinary Shermans, they were Rhinos. More than half of 7 Corps' armoured strength now carried Culin's welded tusks. Each one looked like a beast built for the apocalypse, mud-caked, smoke-streaked, and bristling with crude steel. Behind them marched the 30th Infantry Division and the 2nd Armoured Men who had bled for weeks in the bocage and now saw a chance to finally escape it. At 11 a.m., the first Rhino tank of the 743rd Tank Battalion struck the German line south of La Chapelle-en-Hugues. The embankment loomed ahead, dense with roots and vines, just like every other that had claimed tanks before. The driver gunned the engine. The teeth bit. The hedge split open, tearing apart as if ripped by claws. The tank burst through, levelled its gun, and fired into the nearest farmhouse, obliterating a machine gun nest before it could react. Behind it, a column of infantry poured through the gap. In every direction, the same sight repeated: rhinos charging through hedgerows that had stood for centuries. Fields that had once been death traps became doorways. Platoons that had once crawled on their bellies now advanced upright, keeping pace with their armour. One officer later said, "It was like we'd learned to breathe again." The Germans, stunned by the tempo, fired blindly. Their 88 seconds, once devastating in ambush, could no longer anticipate where the Americans would appear. Every hedgerow had been a boundary. Now every one was a breach. The 2nd SS Panzer Division's war diary that afternoon recorded, "Enemy armour penetrates at multiple points, impossible to predict direction of attack." The bocage, once a map of certainty, had become chaos. By mid-afternoon, entire battalions were advancing 3 miles deep. Communications faltered not from confusion but from speed, the kind of speed Normandy had not seen since the invasion. Infantrymen rode the decks of the Rhinos, ducking low as the tanks smashed through wall after wall, the steel tusks digging, snapping, and throwing debris like snowplows of war. The noise was constant engines roaring, guns firing, hedges tearing. Dust and smoke turned the summer light bronze. Captain Frank Mooney of the 30th Division later wrote, "It was as if the land itself was surrendering. Every wall that stopped us for weeks vanished in seconds. Not every rhino survived. Some broke their tusks on hidden stones, others bogged down in mud or were picked off by anti-tank guns. But the principle had broken the stalemate. For every tank lost, 10 more broke through. By evening, 7 Corps had advanced nearly 6 miles a rate unheard of in the Normandy campaign. The hedgerows that had devoured lives for nearly 2 months now lay behind the American lines, reduced to rubble and churned earth. The German response collapsed into fragmentation. The Luftwaffe, grounded for lack of fuel, could not intervene. Artillery units tried to regroup, but Allied fighter bombers operating from airfields just 20 minutes away tore into them with rockets and strafing runs. The once formidable German defensive grid dissolved under combined arms the Wehrmacht could no longer match. On the ground, American radio operators could barely keep up with the pace. "Our tanks have outdistanced maps," one reported. General Bradley, receiving the updates at his forward command post, allowed himself a rare grin. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are finally out of the hedgerows." The breakout spread like contagion. By July 27th, the 2nd Armoured had pierced through to the open country beyond Saint-Lô. The landscape transformed no longer claustrophobic and green, but wide and sunlit, the fields rolling toward Avranches and the Brittany Plains. Supply trucks followed close behind, their drivers waving at the Rhino tanks that had made it possible. The once futile ingenuity of a sergeant's welding torch had become the pivot of an entire campaign. In the days that followed, the French farmers returned to their shattered fields, bewildered. Where hedges had stood for centuries, now there were gaps big enough to drive trucks through. The earth was blackened, the roots splintered, the ancient boundaries erased. Yet those openings made by steel and necessity marked the beginning of liberation. Culin's invention, dismissed as ridiculous just a month before, now had an official report in the Ordnance Department archives. The notation was terse. Improvised cutter, hedgerow type. Exceptional performance. Adopt for continued use. Nothing more needed to be said. In the chaos of battle, the innovation had done its quiet work. It had turned defense into vulnerability, frustration into momentum. It had given the Allied war machine the one thing Doctrine could not supply: adaptation. The Germans would never recover the initiative. When dusk fell on July 25th, Sergeant Curtis Culin stood beside one of his Rhino tanks near Saint-Lô, its steel tusks bent and scarred from a day of fighting. He ran his hand along the metal, still warm from friction. "It's ugly," he said to the driver beside him, "but it works." Behind them, across Normandy, the hedgerows burned, and for the first time since D-Day, the road to Paris lay open. The speed of the breakout stunned even its architects. Operation COBRA had been conceived as a limited offensive to breach the German lines. Instead, it became an avalanche. The front disintegrated. By the first week of August, American armor was rolling through Avranches and sweeping into Brittany. The hedgerows of Normandy, those ancient earthen tombs, were behind them, left in ruin. Yet few in the higher echelons of command fully understood how much of that momentum had been forged not by grand strategy, but by an idea welded together in a hedgerow field. The Rhino modification, as the official communiques now called it, spread faster than any supply officer could track. From the 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions, it migrated to the 4th, 5th, and 6th. By the end of August, over 1,200 tanks, half-tracks, and even some armoured bulldozers carried the crude but effective tusks. Photographs taken by Signal Corps cameramen showed them charging through the countryside steel beasts crusted in dirt and glory. Newspapers back home printed the images under headlines like "Yankee Ingenuity Breaks the Bocage" and "Rhino Tanks Rampage in France." But behind the headlines was something quieter, deeper. The Rhino cutters marked the moment when the American army truly learned to adapt in real time. Before Normandy, Doctrine ruled the battlefield plans written in staff tents thousands of miles away. After the Rhinos, every sergeant with a welding torch felt empowered to solve a problem himself. Improvisation became institutional. Innovation no longer waited for approval. It simply appeared, tested itself under fire, and if it worked, spread like rumor. At an ordnance depot near Coutances, Captain Walter Mahaffey kept a log of modifications made by frontline units. "We began with Cullin's cutter," he wrote, "and by week's end had 6 new variations, V-shaped, forked, bladed, even one with a roller cut from an axle drum, none identical, all functional." This was no longer a single invention, it was a movement. The change in combat performance was measurable. Intelligence summaries recorded a 60% reduction in tank losses due to hedgerow ambushes after July 25th. Infantry casualties during the same period fell by nearly a third. A small line in a report from 7 Corps summed it up best. Armour and infantry now advance together, the hedgerow problem solved. German field reports from August reveal a very different mood. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps noted bitterly that the enemy's tanks now move through every boundary, like water through a sieve. A surviving after-action document from the 352nd Infantry Division stated, "Our hedgerow defences, once impregnable, are now meaningless. Enemy tanks appear from unexpected directions. Anti-tank guns cannot reorient in time. The landscape that had once favoured the defender now betrayed him." For the men in the field, the sense of transformation was physical. Lieutenant John Blaney of the 743rd Tank Battalion recalled, "Before the Rhinos, every hedgerow was a gamble. You could die just crossing one field. Afterward, we felt like giants. Nothing could stop us." Infantrymen who had once advanced behind tanks with fear now clung to them with confidence. "When those cutters hit the dirt," one GI said, "you knew it was your turn to move." General Omar Bradley later reflected on the episode in his post-war memoir, A Soldier's Story. He admitted that the Army's bureaucratic instinct had nearly smothered the innovation before it began. "We had spent years training for open warfare," Bradley wrote, "and then found ourselves fighting inside a maze. It took a sergeant's torch to burn us a path out." By September, as the Allies crossed the Seine and liberated Paris, Culin's improvised invention was fading from daily use. The hedgerows were gone, the front had moved into open plains. Yet the spirit of the Rhino remained. Tank crews kept the cutters mounted as trophies, symbols of what they had endured and overcome. Mechanics repainted them, sometimes welding the word Rhino in raised letters or carving personal names into the steel: Betsy, Home Wreck, Berlin Express. What had begun as battlefield necessity became legend. In early August, General Eisenhower ordered a formal commendation for Sergeant Curtis G. Culin Jr. The citation praised his resourcefulness and courage in developing an improvised device of great tactical value. Culin himself received the Legion of Merit, though he never saw himself as an inventor. "I just hated seeing men die because a hedge was in the way," he told a reporter modestly. "We had to fix that." Historians later struggled to categorize the Rhino story. It wasn't a technological revolution like radar or the atomic bomb. It was something smaller and, in its way, more profound. It proved that in modern war, innovation could emerge from the bottom up, from necessity and imagination rather than command and theory. The American army that left Normandy was not the same one that had landed there. It had learned flexibility, the lesson every industrial army must learn to survive. At the end of August, the 102nd Cavalry, the very unit where Culin had first welded his crude prototype, rolled through the ruins of a Norman village. Children waved, farmers pointed at the tank's tusks in amazement. A war correspondent walking beside Culin asked what he thought of seeing his idea everywhere. The sergeant smiled, tired and sooty, from weeks of fighting. "Funny thing," he said, "it started because we couldn't go forward. Now we can't stop." He looked out over the road ahead, stretching toward Paris. The sun was setting, the air thick with dust. The sound of engines echoed down the valley, an endless line of Shermans, their steel tusks gleaming red in the dying light. The hedgerows were gone. The wall that had held back an army had been beaten not by firepower, but by imagination and by the stubborn will of soldiers who refused to let dirt dictate destiny. The Rhino had done its work, and in its crude, welded shadow, the modern American way of war was born, when the tanks of the U.S. First Army crossed the Seine in late August 1944, the Rhino cutters began to disappear from the battlefront. In open country, they were no longer needed. The terrain of northern France gave way to rolling plains, where mobility, not ingenuity, dictated victory. But though the welded tusks were discarded, their lesson endured, etched into the steel and doctrine of every army that followed. The transformation had been quiet but absolute. The U.S. army that entered Normandy was an army of planners. The one that left it was an army of problem solvers. No official order had created this change, no general had drafted it into being. It had been welded into existence by men like Curtis Culin, who had proved that initiative could do what bureaucracy could not. After the war, the Ordnance Department's final report on European operations dedicated just a few paragraphs to the device. "Hedgerow cutters," it read dryly, proved highly effective in the Normandy campaign, allowing armoured units to breach defensive terrain features. That was all. No grand tribute. No diagrams in textbooks. Yet within those words lay one of the most important shifts in modern warfare, the recognition that victory often begins in the hands of a sergeant with a blowtorch. The field improvisations of 1944 did not vanish. They evolved. Engineers studying post-war armoured tactics drew a straight line from Culin's cutters to later battlefield adaptations. The bulldozer blades mounted on tanks in Korea, the mine plows and rollers of Vietnam, the modular combat kits of the 21st century. Each carried the same DNA machines, altered by their operators, built for survival under conditions no designer could foresee. In 1945, as the war ended, Culin returned home to New Jersey. He tried to resume civilian life, working as a mechanic and later as a machinist. He rarely spoke of his invention unless pressed. In a 1946 interview with the New York Times, he dismissed his fame with characteristic modesty. "We just had a problem that needed solving. Any of the boys could have done it." But among tankers and engineers, his name lingered. His innovation became shorthand for the moment when American ingenuity turned desperation into dominance. The army remembered, too quietly but persistently. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, the Ordnance Museum displayed one of the surviving Rhino Shermans. Its steel tusks, pitted and rusted from Normandy soil, bore the scars of history. Officers visiting the museum in the 1,950 seconds would pause before it, reminded that doctrine alone never wins wars. By the 1,960 seconds, as new wars loomed in Asia, the principle of field modification had become official. The Army's Field Manual 5-15, Engineer Combat Operations, included an entire section titled Improvisation in the Field. It cited the hedgerow cutter as a classic example of tactical engineering innovation, the first time the device was formally enshrined in doctrine. The manual's closing line echoed Culin's spirit. A commander's greatest weapon is not his equipment, but his ability to adapt it. At a 1962 U.S. Japanese Aviation and Armor History Symposium in Tokyo, former German and Japanese officers shared recollections of Allied innovations. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Frey, who had fought with the 2nd Panzer Division, spoke candidly of the shock the rhinos had caused. "We thought the hedgerows would hold them for weeks," he said. "Then, one morning, the earth itself began to open. Tanks came through as if the walls had never existed. We realized then we had lost France." In Normandy, the land healed, the craters filled, the hedgerows regrew, but here and there, farmers still found rusted fragments of steel cutters buried in their fields. They became curiosities, artifacts of an invasion that had reshaped both the land and the minds of men. At the small museum in Saint-Lô, a plaque beneath one such relic reads, "Made from the enemy's defences, used to free France." By the time of the 1985 Pacific and European Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the surviving tankers of the 2nd Armored Division were old men. They gathered around photographs of their rhinos and spoke in the quiet, reverent tones reserved for old comrades. One veteran, when asked what he remembered most, didn't speak of fear or glory. "It was the sound," he said, "that crunch when the teeth hit the hedge. You knew then that you were going through, that nothing could stop you anymore." For military historians, the Rhino became a case study in adaptation under fire. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans displays one today beside a diagram of the hedgerows it defeated. Visitors often linger over the contrast between its crude appearance and its massive impact. The placard calls it an idea that changed a campaign. Nothing more is needed. In retrospect, the story of the Rhino isn't about metal at all. It's about a change in thought, a realization that technology is not fixed, that weapons evolve through use, and that victory belongs to those willing to reshape their tools to meet the moment. In that sense, the true legacy of Culin's invention lies not in Normandy's fields, but in every modern workshop where soldiers and engineers still improvise solutions to impossible problems. In the summer of 1944, a single welder turned German steel into an American breakthrough. 4 decades later, his lesson remained unchallenged, that ingenuity, when armed with courage and necessity, can change the course of history. The Rhino's tusks now rest in museums, their weld seams corroded and dull. But in every army that prizes initiative, in every field manual that speaks of adaptation, its echo endures a reminder that wars are not only won by plans drawn in ink, but by sparks struck on steel in the hands of men who refuse to stop at the wall. In the final months of the war, while the tanks of Patton's Third Army rolled through Germany and the Pacific still burned, the U.S. Army quietly began collecting its lessons. Engineers, tacticians, and historians combed through battlefields and reports, searching for patterns, trying to turn the chaos of war into doctrine. Amid those thousands of pages, buried in the appendices of a logistical study, appeared one unassuming entry. Field Modification Tank-Mounted Hedgerow Cutter, devised June 1944, Normandy. Resulted in marked increase in operational tempo during Operation COBRA. Recommendation: encourage controlled local innovation in future theatres. It was a dry, bureaucratic sentence, but it marked a revolution. For the first time, the US Army had acknowledged that invention could, and sometimes should, come from below. By 1946, at Fort Knox and Aberdeen, engineers began drafting what they called Field Adaptation Doctrine, a framework for how armies could learn faster than their enemies. The premise was simple: modern war was too complex, too fluid for static plans. It required soldiers capable of engineering solutions under fire. The hedgerow cutter was cited as proof of concept. Officers who had fought in Normandy led the effort. General James Van Fleet, then at the infantry school, gave a lecture that year titled The Bocage and the Birth of the Rhino. He told cadets, "Wars are not won by what we bring, but by what we build when what we bring isn't enough." His words would echo decades later in every military engineering program that taught creative problem-solving as doctrine, not improvisation. In Washington, the lesson took institutional form. The Army created the Ordnance Research and Development Division Sub-Office for Field Expedients, a cumbersome name for a simple idea. Never let a good improvisation die at the front line. The first study they published, in 1947, opened with the sentence, "From scrap, we made speed." The report's cover bore a black and white photo of a Rhino Sherman bursting through a Norman hedge. Physically, few rhinos survived. Most were dismantled after the breakout, their cutters removed, melted, or left behind in French fields. Yet the handful that remained became relics of a new mindset. One was shipped to the Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen, another to Fort Benning, and a third one of Culin's original second armoured prototypes to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where it remains today, a steel-toothed silhouette against a mural of the Normandy countryside. Visitors often assume it's a post-war reconstruction, something built for display. The guides correct them gently. No, this was built in a field, under fire, by men who didn't know they were changing history. The welds, rough and uneven, are still visible. You can see where the torch flared too long, where the steel cooled unevenly. It is not elegant, it is human. That imperfection became its lesson. When the Army redesigned its training manuals in the 1950 seconds, initiative under pressure became a formal leadership trait. West Point's engineering curriculum added a new principle to its design philosophy: form follows necessity. Instructors referenced the Rhino alongside the Bailey Bridge and the Higgins boat as proof that war favours practicality over perfection. From Normandy to modern battlefields, Culin's legacy stretched beyond his lifetime. The same logic turning the terrain against itself would reappear in Korea, when tanks used dozer blades to carve gun positions in frozen hills, and in Vietnam, when Rome plows cleared jungle trails for convoys. In both wars, commanders cited Normandy's lessons in after-action reports. The phrases differed, but the essence was constant: adapt, build, overcome. Even in the 21st century, the echo endures. In Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers welded makeshift armor onto Humvees to resist roadside bombs, creating the first hillbilly armor long before MRAPs rolled off production lines. Pentagon analysts studying those improvisations would later invoke the same lineage, from the Rhinos of Normandy to the gun trucks of Fallujah. The line of inheritance was unbroken. Curtis G. Culin Jr. lived quietly after the war, content to let history speak for him. In 1963, the Army invited him to Fort Knox to view the museum's Rhino exhibit. He arrived wearing his old uniform coat, the medal ribbons faded, his hands still calloused from a lifetime of work. Standing before the tank that bore his name, he said only, "It looks smaller than I remember." The hedges didn't. He died in 1963, aged 52. His obituary in the Newark Evening News mentioned his wartime invention in a single line. Mr. Culin designed a device used by Allied tanks to cut through the hedgerows of Normandy. The modest phrasing suited him, but to the men who had followed those tanks through the green walls of France, his creation had been nothing less than liberation made visible. Today, military historians call the Rhino the prototype of adaptive warfare, a reminder that the most decisive weapons are often improvised. Its spirit lives not in blueprints, but in the culture of every modern army that values ingenuity over orthodoxy. A rusted hedgerow cutter still, and sits on display in Saint-Lô, near the rebuilt town centre. Schoolchildren on field trips run their fingers along its jagged steel, not realizing they are touching one of the quiet miracles of the 20th century. Above it, a small plaque reads in French and English, "Made from the enemy's iron, forged by necessity. It gave freedom a path." That was the true legacy of the Rhino, proof that even in a world ruled by machines, it is still the human imagination, the spark struck from desperation, that carves the road forward. On a summer morning, the hedgerows of Normandy are beautiful again. The air is thick with the scent of wildflowers and soil. Sunlight filters through tangled green walls that once hid machine guns and mortars. To the tourists who visit the quiet lanes outside Saint-Lô, it is hard to imagine that, 80 years ago, these same hedges were soaked with fire and blood. The land has healed, but the ghosts remain. A few miles from the rebuilt city stands a small museum, housed in what was once a farmhouse command post. Inside, behind glass, sits a piece of steel no longer than a man's arm, rusted, pitted, unmistakable. Its crude weld seams are still visible. The placard beside it reads, "Fragment of a Sherman hedgerow cutter, 2nd Armoured Division, July 1944. The curator, a French historian named Marcel Dupont, gestures toward it with quiet reverence when visitors ask about its significance. "This," he says, "was made from the steel of German beach obstacles by Americans who turned their enemies' defenses into their own weapon. From this, our liberation began." The story of the Rhino has never needed embellishment. It survives in the testimonies of men who witnessed it, the welders, the drivers, the infantry who followed those steel beasts through walls of earth that had stopped an army. The U.S. National Archives holds Cullin's original field sketch, pencil on oily paper, dated the 14th of June 1944, with a note scrawled at the bottom, "To be tested tomorrow." 80 years later, that sketch remains the most honest image of wartime innovation, a rough idea born of frustration, urgency, and courage. Every few years, American and French veterans or their descendants gather near the hedgerows outside Saint-Lô. They bring photos, fragments of shrapnel, even bits of welded steel they've found in the fields. Some bring stories passed down from fathers or grandfathers who rode the Rhino Shermans. One former French resistance fighter, now in his 90s, summed it up best. "The tanks with teeth. That's when the war began to move again." In the decades after 1945, the Rhino's influence quietly shaped the philosophy of American military design. The principle was simple but profound: make tools adaptable. The post-war engineers at Lockheed and General Motors, many of whom were veterans, internalized that lesson. The P-80 jet's modular systems, the M-48 Patton's removable armor skirts, even the Apollo lunar module's redundant controls, all echoed the same creed of flexibility over perfection. The idea crossed disciplines. Civil engineers cited it when designing rapid bridge-building systems. The newly formed National Science Foundation used it in 1950 as a case study of distributed innovation. Military colleges adopted it as a case study in adaptive leadership. What had begun as a field improvisation became a doctrine of American problem-solving, that invention thrives best not in comfort, but in crisis. By the 1972nd, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had formalized battlefield modification protocols, directly referencing Culin-type adaptations in their manuals. The same approach would appear decades later in NASA's Apollo 13 contingency design framework, a lineage that ran from a Normandy field to outer space. For all its influence, the human story remained humble. Curtis Culin Jr. never became a celebrity inventor. He died young, without wealth or fame, and was buried in Arlington National Cemetery beneath a simple headstone. It reads only his name, rank, and unit. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin Jr., 102nd Cavalry, New Jersey. No mention of the device that changed the war, yet his comrades remembered. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, the surviving members of the 2nd Armoured Division commissioned a memorial in his honour. They placed it near Carentan, on ground once soaked in their sweat. A bronze plaque bears an engraving of a Sherman tank crashing through a hedgerow, the teeth of its cutter gleaming in the sculptor's cast light. The inscription reads, "He gave us a way forward." When the dedication ceremony ended, a handful of aging tankers gathered beside the monument. One of them, his voice cracked with age, said simply, "We made it home because he couldn't stand to stop." No one spoke after that. The wind through the hedges carried the rest. Today, the Rhino lives on, not only in history books, but in spirit. Engineers study it as an example of design thinking. Military officers teach it as a lesson in initiative. Entrepreneurs invoke it as a metaphor for innovation under constraint. The idea transcended war because it was never really about tanks or hedgerows. It was about people, ordinary people, who refused to accept impossible terrain as fate. Every generation rediscovers the lesson in its own way. When soldiers in Iraq bolted scrap metal to their Humvees in 2004, they called it hillbilly armor. The Pentagon called it the modern Rhino moment. When NASA engineers improvised air filters on Apollo 13, flight director Gene Kranz described it later as our Normandy hedgerow. The phrase had become shorthand for doing the impossible with what you have. On the 80th anniversary of Operation COBRA, a small ceremony was held at the Normandy American Cemetery. The descendants of Culin's squad stood among rows of white marble crosses, looking out over the same beaches where the raw steel of his invention had first been found. As the sun set over Omaha, an American officer placed a single welding torch, its handle wrapped in the colors of both nations, at the base of a memorial stone. The inscription carved beneath it was new but familiar. From wreckage, he made a weapon. From resistance, a road. From necessity, victory. The crowd was silent for a long time. Then, from somewhere beyond the hedges, a distant tractor engine growled through the dusk, its metal teeth biting softly into the earth. 80 years on, the land had reclaimed its peace, but in every field that still bears the faint pattern of the old bocage, the echo of steel remains the reminder that even in war, invention is not born of destruction, but of the human refusal to stop at the wall.